Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Okay, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. I've never done webinar format before, so I guess what will happen is we can't see anybody,
Right.
and hopefully somebody will be available to help us with any further questions. But
And we have the hour, right?
yes.
Okay.
So what I think I'm gonna do is, I don't know if we're gonna be introduced by somebody else or not, but if we aren't, I'll do a quick introduction.
Okay.
And then, with those 3 topics that I shared with you all, we'll just get started with them, and hopefully that will take until at least half after.
Yeah, I
And
think
then,
so.
and then we'll see if people have questions,
Great.
but I think some of the presentations have ended earlier, so we don't need to feel pressure to fill the hour, especially if people are not engaging. And then I noticed on the schedule, there are literally like 5 things happening at the same time. So, hi Corey, good morning.
Good morning.
So, again, I'm not holding my breath that we're gonna have thousands of people joining us,
Yeah.
because there are literally like 5 other panels at the same time. It's like the busiest time of the conference, so. But we'll see. Thank you, by the way, for taking your Saturday to do this. I really appreciate on behalf of S3A.
It's
Not a
all.
problem.
At least it's not 8 o'clock in the morning, right?
I can do 11.
Yeah, 11's okay.
Yeah, those AAL meetings at 8, where like 95% of the people have the camera off, I was like, there's a reason for that.
There's a huge reason. Well,
Yeah.
but even like, when we were in the normal world, I once had a conference presentation in New Orleans on a Sunday morning
Oh,
at 8 a.m. So it was me, myself, I, and the one lone stalwart conference goer. And I'm like, well, it's a line on the CV. Everybody was sleeping off whatever they did the night before in the French Quarter. And
yeah.
Yeah.
I had a presentation once. This was in Baltimore. This national conference asked me to do a sort of like, not really a workshop, but to do a session for people that were interested in this other organization that I belong to.
Good morning.
Good morning. And so I was like, fine, I'll go to the conference. And we curated something like a video screening that was supposed to be projected on the side of a building. So we actually had an elaborate participation. So I arrived at the conference on Thursday, and I was not in the program at all. And I was like, I came all the way here, I took time from work, and I'm not even in the program. So then that evening they corrected in the announcement for the keynote. But then they added me to Saturday morning at 7:30 a.m.
Yay.
In a room with no projection or media. It was literally a little meeting room. And actually 5 people showed up, which I was totally shocked. But I had to like flip my laptop to them because there was no screen. Anyways, just telling a little horror story, Simone, of
That was last week or this week?
oh, this was like years ago. This is a 2000.
Well, we had a little bit of trouble this morning also in the main room with Roberto Lugo. Took him half an hour to log on to be able to get in Zoom.
Oh, no.
It was stressful, but it was a beautiful lecture. So if you get to it later, it was amazing.
He's an amazing speaker. I've
He
seen
is. So he improvised, was great. So let's make a plan for today, guys. I made the introduction for the 3 of you. Is that okay? Or you? Yeah? Okay.
Perfect.
Fine, yes.
Yeah, so that's my plan. And then I'll just pass the word. Do you need a question, a prompt, or just let you talk?
No, well, I think I'm gonna sort of get us kicked off.
Good, okay.
Do we have 3 different prompts for ourselves?
No, go ahead.
And then if there are anybody, if there are people in the room, we'll leave some room for questions.
Okay, this is a time where we have 6 sessions at the same time.
Yeah.
And the maximum attendees we have had at I didn't look this morning how many, probably we had a lot because of the students. But normally has been 16 people in the main room, and some of the sessions have been pretty quiet. Okay. So don't expect a lot, but the good part of this is that we are recording and we're going to have the footage to use later on. Okay.
That's fine. Yeah, we were actually talking about that before you came, that, you know,
yeah, it's so nice to have the 3 of you here, you know. So thank you for joining us, Margo. Let me put the gallery view so I can see better. Yes. Corey, Margo. Yeah, you guys are new, both of you. Did you know each other from Texas, Margo and Vagner?
No, we were far enough away that it could have been like the whole state of Rhode Island, right?
Yes, well, Texas, yes.
Yeah.
Anything in Texas is like that, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But I have a lot of good colleagues who were at Wagner's former institution there.
Yeah, vice versa. Yeah, I think I lived closer to Oklahoma than to Dallas, or maybe about the same distance.
Guys, I'm the only person without a background. Do I need one?
No, well, I have a blurry one. Maybe I should put a picture.
I have picture and I have blurry ones too, but I think I'm gonna do. What do you think? It's too formal. I think if I put I feel too institutional if I do the. Yeah, but how about you, Corey? How long have you been in Altoona?
It's coming up on 3 years now. So
you are all young people.
I'm still one of the newest people on campus. So
yeah, that's good. Excellent. So welcome, the 3 of you. Let me know when it all has a little bit of a breeze. It's rainy. It's a very rainy, gray day here today in Seattle. You know,
it's actually sunny here okay, I'll put this.
It's 50s. I even put a heavy clothes today because it's cold.
Yeah.
Yes.
Before moving here, I lived in Portland, Oregon for over a decade, so I know
know the weather well.
Spring comes and goes.
Yep, it's
although
true.
it did try to snow here last weekend, so
the picture behind you is the campus, Corey?
It is.
I'm not familiar with the Altoona campus.
Yeah, the Altoona campus is actually built on a former amusement park site. Wow. And so what's behind me it actually had one of the largest public swimming pools in the country. That's not it behind me. That's actually the holding tank for warming the water that used to go into the swimming pool, which was even larger than that. So that's
serious. It's a serious thing.
Yeah, it's really, it looks like a big pond. It's only about 1.5 feet deep because it's a warming pond. And so our students use it to ice skate and play ice hockey in the winter.
Cool.
Wow, fabulous. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the beautiful Penn State Abington campus was a private women's finishing school, and Amelia Earhart was one of the alumni from here at that time. So it's a beautiful campus north of Philadelphia. Really, really beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah, I was gonna say something about the campus, but maybe we should start so I say that
yes,
on time, on clue. Yeah, 1 more minute. There we go. Anything else you guys need?
I think we're good. So is somebody going to be here to monitor the questions or not?
I think it'll be me, and I'll take my sound off. I'll be quiet and I'll do my best. I'm not super good with reading the chat but I think Vagner, you're ahead of me with this, monitoring a lot. Yeah, and I think hopefully we'll have some questions.
Yes.
Yes. But we can end earlier too. We don't have to, to continue if you feel that,
We had a pretty good, we met last week, I think, or the week before that, and we had a pretty good conversation. So
we
can talk for 45 minutes.
So, yeah, it is time right now. I just wonder if we should wait one more minute or just start. You tell me.
Your call. Maybe wait 1 minute or so.
Yeah.
You
Just
know,
so far,
people
it's just-
get in and
okay. I'll take this.
Well, I'm hoping that once this pandemic is over, we can visit one another.
mhm,
Well, yeah, that's what I was gonna say. The original plan was this symposium would take place at Abington.
mhm.
Oh,
And
nice.
we were already, scouting places in Philadelphia to take field trips and walks, and
Mhm.
it was a year ago.
Well, we're ready to host it the next time.
Yeah, it's already in the plan.
We have a do-over.
Yeah, and we have, had a couple of walks,
Mhm.
artists doing walks, and I think we're gonna do a lot more outside because after this, right, we're more than ready.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, guys, I'm gonna start, all right?
Mhm.
So, good morning and welcome to the session, Higher Education in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Simone Osthoff, and I am the director of the S3A. We are honored by your presence here today, supporting the S3A Alliance between the visual arts programs at University Park, Abington, and Altoona. This collaboration has been an important part of our work over the last 2 years, including the organization of our inaugural exhibition and symposium. And by the way, yeah, I just mentioned, right? The catalog for the exhibition was launched on Thursday evening, and it can be found on our website under the symposium tab. So if you have time, just take a moment to take a look. The text in the catalog, the introduction is mine. So I'm gonna just introduce the three of you briefly, and then you go ahead with the discussion. So Dr. Margo DelliCarpini, did I say it right, Margo?
You did, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Margo DelliCarpini assumed the position of Chancellor and Dean of Penn State Abington on January 4th, 2021. So very recently, welcome to Penn State.
Thank you.
Prior to arriving at Abington, she was Vice Provost for Strategic Educational Partnerships and Dean of the College of Education and Human Development at University of Texas at San Antonio. A first-generation non-traditional student, Dr. DelliCarpini experienced firsthand the opportunity that higher education provides for students, the role institutions of higher education play as cultural and intellectual hubs in their communities, and the impact of higher education on the economic mobility of graduates. She earned her bachelor's degree in linguistics, master's degree in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other language. This is the first time I heard TESOL. I didn't know what it was. I had to Google. And her doctoral degrees in linguistics. They are all from the State University in New York, Stony Brook. She's a licensed English as a second language educator and school district administrator through the New York State Education Department. Griffin is Associate Dean of Research and Academic Affairs at Penn State Altoona, advocating for faculty and student research, excuse me, across all disciplines. He oversees all internal and external research funding at the Altoona campus. For research that focuses on how to make buildings healthier, more productive, and resilient, while simultaneously reducing their impact on the planet, he received as principal investigator more than $1.5 million in external funding from agencies such as the National Science Foundation, the WMCAC Foundation, various industry partners, among others. With graduate degrees in architecture and structural engineering, Professor Griffin recently served as a Fulbright Scholar to the National University of Ireland in Galway, and he has taught architecture design and engineering courses at both graduate and undergraduate levels for over a decade at 4 different universities. And Vagner Mendonça-Whitehead is director of the School of Visual Arts, a unit of the College of Arts and Architecture at University Park. And he started his tenure on September 2020. It's been a year, right, Wagner? So prior to Penn State, he was the chair of the Department of Visual Arts at Texas Women's University. And before Texas, he was part of the faculty at Oakland University and Southern Illinois University. As an artist, Mendonça-Whitehead's practice encompasses traditional and newer media art making, curatorial projects, and creative writing on visual culture. His artworks have been exhibited nationally and internationally in group and solo shows in galleries and museums, as well as film and video festivals. His writings in the form of critical and poetic essays have equally been presented in national and international professional conferences. Mendonça-Whitehead was the president of the New Media Caucus from 2014 to 17. In 2016, he was elected as an Emerging Arts Educator Fellow with the National Council for Arts Education and a fellow with the Advocacy Leadership Institute for the National Association for Latino Arts and Culture. He currently serves on the board of directors for the National Council of Arts Administrators, focusing on equality, on equity, and social media initiatives. Mendonça-Whitehead holds degrees from the Savannah College of Art and Design and the University of Florida in Gainesville. I think this is it for now. I have one question for later. Welcome the three of you, and I'll just turn my microphone mute.
Thank you so much, Simone, for the lovely introductions. Good morning, everybody. We are here to talk about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic in higher education. And because we are housed under the shelter section of this conference, we created three metaphorical categories for our conversations. And I'll start with the first one as a prompt, and then we'll move on to the next two. So the first one is shelter in place, which is a term that became pretty ubiquitous in the beginning of the pandemic. So I would love for us to share some of our experiences with the COVID impact in student life, student learning, facilities, access, et cetera, et cetera. So whoever wants to go first, that would be great. What have been some of the things that you have observed or learned from or unexpected had to adapt to in the beginning of the pandemic in your roles at the different locations?
I'm happy to start with this one. I think that one of the things that is obvious is that, particularly in my field of architecture, that a lot of our education, because of its sort of cohort mentoring model, for decades has required in-person interactions with one another, right? That we have a studio culture, as happens in many of the arts, that extends far beyond just the instruction, right? That it's not just the instructor meeting with the students in a physical environment together, but it's that those students inhabit that space and make work next to each other and alongside each other and learn from one another, see what another person's doing at a desk next to yours, have conversations that occur, sometimes late into the evenings about their practice and their work. And so you can imagine that during our spring break at Penn State in 2020, the decision was made to go fully remote, and that was very abrupt. And it was for everyone. And so those early stages were simply figuring out I would say the technical ways of which we speak to one another in order to continue our semester. But then spending that time over the summer to figure out, what things could return in person and how, and if they couldn't return in person, how could they take on either a hybrid approach or a remote approach? I think Penn State is unique in some ways in that there wasn't a university-wide mandate that we go with one mode, that we actually had faculty members and administrators had choice to figure out, okay, given the restrictions that we have on our physical spaces and how people can interact, what's the best way to deliver education now for the next year? Is it to be fully remote? Is it to do some sort of hybrid situation where some things are remote and some things are in person? Or to try to the best of our ability to do things fully in person? And I think that was that was the path that we adopted from the very beginning in the fall, and the one we've continued on to this year. And so I think that probably helps with the overview of the context of what was been going on here at Penn State. Maybe one of the other you sort of answer the specifics of how it's changed the way that we do our instruction specifically.
Margo?
I think, when I think about observing the impacts, one of the things that we know, and these are conversations that we have had for a very long time in the education, across our educational spectrum, is disparities in access, digital equity, device equity. The pandemic, these problems, these challenges have existed, but for me, I think the pandemic has really taken the veil off of these and has pushed this conversation to the forefront, which is a good thing. More sectors of our community and our society are understanding that these disparities exist and what the real impact is. And we know that they disproportionately affect our communities of color, our Indigenous communities, our Latinx communities, our Black communities. And so for me, that has really focused us as a campus on addressing these disparities across different spectrums. We also have seen, again, that among college students specifically, we've seen increased rates of depression and anxiety compared to previous non-COVID years. So when we think about sheltering in place, for many students, this has resulted in additional responsibilities around caregiving, around homeschooling, around either complete job loss or reduction in income. So food insecurity, housing insecurity, socioeconomic insecurities. Our international students also have special considerations. Penn State Abington has a large number of international students, and considerations for them related on where to live, their own economic stability, and very difficult decisions around either staying here in the United States or returning to their home countries added to this stress and anxiety. So, I think we've learned lessons, and one of the things that I've really been focused on with my leadership team is carrying those lessons with us. What have we learned, and what are we going to continue to do? So when I think about sustainability in this space of the effects of shelter in place and the impact on student life and learning in our academic facilities, I think one thing we've really learned is to be better communicators. Communication is key, reaching out is key, and sometimes just reaching out means asking students, how are they doing? It doesn't have to be a huge message, but just simply asking. But we've become better at the use of social media and other, texting to meet students where they are. Not everybody reads emails that come from the Chancellor. But text messaging and social media, we've really become more intentional about how we communicate. Also, reaching out to special populations is critical. So tailoring our message. When we think about sustainability, again, those generic one-size-fits-all messages, we know they don't work. And I think we've learned a lot of good lessons as a result of sheltering in place and the effects that this has had on us as higher education institutions. But really, being very intentional, tailoring messages, thinking about the information we're giving. So what is that information, and specifically, how does it impact a particular population, and who are we giving that information to? I think something that I would hate to lose is the fact that we've learned that flexibility is a good thing. It actually adds to our success and our outcomes. And being flexible for students, both in terms of how they enter our university, so creating multiple entryways. Penn State is test optional right now and will remain so through the next year. That's open doors for a lot of students. So I think I want to continue to think about access and how what we've learned has increased access for our populations. And then really the well-being of our students, focusing on social and emotional support, creating community to combat loneliness and isolation, Interestingly, we found that a lot of the events that we had, and we both created, we created new programming, but then shifted our traditional programming to remote environments. We have found a lot of those things were much more highly attended than they were when they were in person. And I think that speaks to the fact that large numbers of our students, it's not, engagement is not for lack of desire, it's for lack of opportunity and access. So I think keeping that with us and making sure that we, as we return to engagement, which everybody wants to do, also remember that we have other ways of messaging and other ways of engaging. And I think those are some takeaways for a sustainable future in this space.
Yes, I really like what you said about that the veil was taken off of, because, you know, parallel to the pandemic, and although these were not new things in this country, the rise of social distress, you know, in a very public way, and open conversations about anti-racism have also been both difficult and important conversations for us to have during this period. On my role as director of the school, but even in my previous job as well, since I moved here mid-pandemic, I am both amazed at the resilience of the faculty and students of getting through this process, because if you really think about it, we had a shift in the spring of 2020. Most people did not have a true summer. And then the fall, there was a shift again. And then in the spring, there was, I think there was a third shift, because people realized what worked and what didn't work in the fall. And then they had to adapt again. And as we're preparing for a new summer and a new fall, I think a lot of this instability, you know, causes a lot of stress, obviously, and uncertainty, but also they show how we can rise above it. And back in March of 2020, I think this is what a lot of us were just really happily surprised in terms of like removing the veil. People can adapt much quicker than we think we can, right? And of course, this wasn't overall, but you know, a lot of faculty, and I imagine in other areas aside from the arts, have been resistant to online teaching, right? And I think this has really changed, and I'm really curious to know what will happen in the future, in the coming years. As like you said, you both said, you know, we need to keep what is good and revisit what hasn't worked or has been negative, because this also heightens that, right? So we have this direct access to information, but the same access can also hold people back, right? I think in addition to family situations, one thing that was at the discourse at Texas Women's University was that people sometimes had to shelter in place in abusive contexts, right? Especially women and women of color were highly affected by that. And in the beginning of the pandemic, the violence had increased dramatically, right? So this is something to think about, because for better or for worse, our students' lives and even our colleagues' lives, you know, faculty and staff, they do inform what happens at the university, right? We are in a unique sort of work environment that we're more than just work. It is a community of learning with different kinds of stakeholders. But anyways, moving on to the next one, community as shelter, rebuilding community during a global pandemic. So maybe what are some strategies, and you all have touched a little bit upon it, that you or venues or ventures that you approached in trying to rebuild community in a sort of centralized, like digitally centralized but physically decentralized context?
So I can start with that. You know, I'm very committed to campus as community, and also a community engaged campus. I really believe that in higher education, especially public higher education, it's our obligation to partner with our communities and define broadly community. So I think one thing that we've learned is that I think in addition to being responsive, because as Vagner, as you said, we kind of last March 2020, we responded. We were reactionary. We had to respond to these events and make these very quick pivots and move very quickly. But then as time went on, I think the lessons that we learned are that our community's needs were even greater than before, and moving out of response mode to basically rebuilding mode. So once we've made those responses, once we've ensured safety and tried to address disparities and continue to address those, how do we move from that responsive mode to one where we're really understanding the needs of our community? So I think it's caused, the pandemic and our response has caused major transformation of how we think about community and how we think about student life, how we've responded, and then how we've continued to understand the needs of our communities. And, I think this is probably the theme of our panel here, is that rebuilding after COVID should not mean going back to the way things exactly were. If we turn the COVID switch off, and I wish somebody would do that, we shouldn't look like we did, 2019. So what are the lessons learned to make us better, more responsive, more engaged, and really a more connected community? So again, we had to focus on the response to the pandemic, but I think the focus now on recovery is really critical. Rebuilding should focus on long-term planning that really helps us emerge stronger by rethinking systems and coming out for both our individuals and our communities more resilient, more successful, and more sustainable. I think ensuring equity and access in services and resources is critical. And again, I think this is something that has now been pushed to the forefront of all of our conversations. And I think it's taught us also to look at things from a bottom-up rather than top-down lens. And what I mean by that is really understanding the needs of our communities, however we define community, and develop solutions that work for them in collaboration with them, because there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And as tempting as it is to want to go back to the way things were, it's critical to sustainability that we really re-examine our practices, that we critically analyze and challenge ourselves to make these needed changes. And we showed ourselves that we can actually change pretty quickly in higher education without damage and actually coming out stronger. And I think of it as empowering our communities to really collaboratively create sustainable progress towards greater opportunity for all. And I've seen that, talk about our faculty, the unsung heroes are our IT support staff who really help make all of this possible and continue. But our students, and Vagner, you talked about the social unrest that our students have been experiencing. In my 20 some odd years in higher education, I have never seen such an environment, and our poor students having to respond over and over and over again. So our student support staff have been critical in just creating opportunities for reflection and for processing and just safe spaces on our campuses, both physically and metaphorically. And I think those moving forward, I think we've become more empathetic. And I think that should be sustainable, and that's something that will sustain us.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, for the audience that is coming from outside of Penn State, I think the first thing to realize is that we're a unique institution and that we are one university geographically dispersed. And so we have campuses throughout the Commonwealth that serve a wide range of larger communities, right? And so I think about those interactions as well. In many cases, those have been impacted perhaps most of all. We've been able to keep some level of interaction between faculty, staff, students, either in person or remotely, and having the flexibility that Margo's talked about, which I also hope continues into the future. Perhaps in different ways. I mean, I think I've seen we were having conversations pre-pandemic just about, how few students were coming to organized events, right? Like that through both on the academic affairs side and student affairs side. How can we draw students into programming that we think will help build community, right? That's really the goal. And one of the things that we found through this pandemic, that in some cases, things that we've done sort of post going remote have actually drawn more students in. One of the things I find most interesting is that we have faculty reporting that more students are coming to their online office hours than ever came to their physical office hours. So in some ways, there's whole new senses of community being built because of the opportunities. If I hate that, it seems, I don't like talking about them as silver linings, because the pandemic is a horrible, horrible thing. But it has opened doors that we didn't know were possible and didn't know would be things that students would even want, right? I could not have predicted that students would want to have remote office hours with their faculty, and that would be something that we should be even offering, right, as a way to increase that interaction in that part of our community. But going back to our larger community, one of the things that my office oversees are our community relationships and things that we particularly do with inside our classes. Altoona has a number of courses that engage community partners to give our students in different disciplines, real world experiences in their fields. Not just through internships, which is a more traditional way of doing that, but through sort of course-based, community-engaged strategies. And those, unfortunately, had to get paused. The risk of the interactions, and it is harder. We have our fabulous IT support, but that is harder to extend that out to the larger community in order to make sure that our community partners have the same resources, or can have access even to our own resources at Penn State in order to keep those relationships going. It really hit home just how much the physical presence of the students in another physical environment was such a part of those community relationships. And that we actually, I think of the things that we had a hard time figuring out how to do remotely, that was a major one. And so I think that as vaccination rates go up and that we can interact in person again, that those will be easy to rebuild, because they were multi-year, long-term relationships we had with some community organizations. It was something that in this category of community as shelter took a hit. I think the other thing too is that I'm here representing one of our Altoona itself is not rural, but our students come from a 5-county area that is relatively rural. And so for those students, again, that come from our more rural communities, to be at home, I think was very isolating for them, particularly early in the pandemic. And going back to, I think, an earlier point about sheltering in place, is that the technology sort of gap is real. That, in terms of devices, we had students who were trying to do remote education on a cell phone. They did not have laptops, and they had to use their cell phones because they did not have reliable internet service in their communities. One of the major initiatives on our campus was actually getting those students cellular Wi-Fi hubs so that they could have the internet access in order to continue remotely. So I think that that's the other unique thing that we see at Penn State, is because our campuses are in so many different communities throughout our Commonwealth, we saw like the full gamut of pandemic related issues. I really like what Margo said, that the veil was lifted on that inequity very quickly. And we had to respond to it as equally fast in order to provide more equity for our students, in places that we might have been, I'll say, a little blind to previously, because of the resources we have on campus, right, that can help try to equalize those disparities. But when students can't physically access them, that we have to find other ways to provide that.
Yeah, one thing that resonated with me as well is this notion of safe space. I have been rereading for a different project, Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. And even back then, she was talking about the classroom as a space for empathy and critical discourse, right? And in my 20 plus years as well, I have noticed that, especially in the arts and in the context of a larger university, the art studio is a safe space. That these students sometimes they did not find themselves being understood in different areas of the university, for example. So what happens when the actual space is not accessible anymore, right? Again, for international students, we had a lot of issues with what they would do between semesters, right? Because if they left the country, they wouldn't be able to return, or they don't have any family to go for Christmas, or they don't celebrate Christmas. So it's a, the architectural space, which can become a safe space, that disappeared as well. But and then from my perspective as a new director, even though I have experience, who has experience of the pandemic, right? And how do I get to know my new community, right? This has been a major challenge, right? And I'm having to learn as we go, right? And I'm sure it's the same thing with you, Margo, because you have been here pretty recently as well. But at the same time, these changes happen even if you have been in an institution for a long time. I think I started college 30 years ago, and the way college life was back then and the way college life is today are very, very different. And the kind of support that we offer for students are very, very different, right? And I think next year, or whatever calendar year we have post-pandemic, I think will be really, really telling on how we balance the new with the world, with the old, and the new. Right. So if you think of the pandemic as new, the post-pandemic will also be new. Mm-hmm. And we'll still have the old, which is, all within 3 years time space. I think trying to negotiate these three different notions of what higher education is will be a lot of work, but it'll be interesting as well, because one thing that I like about the roles that we have is that we actually have a lot of agency in terms of transforming and affecting what's invisible to students and faculty especially. We do a lot of work in the background that they may not know that we're doing. And I actually think most of us have extremely good intentions as well, even though that's not the perception at times. But I think, we have a lot of agency as a group, maybe not as individuals, but as a group, we have a lot of agency in influencing the direction that our institutions go to. So this sort of is a good segue to the last section for this discussion, which is sustainability as shelter, imagining and actualizing futures in academia in a post-pandemic context. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I can follow up on things I said. I think that I had no idea that there is an appetite for students to do things remotely, right? And so I can imagine a future where we have a more hybrid sort of existence continuing on, that there will be interactions that we have just like this that are on a screen that have equal, if not more value to in-person ones, depending on the context, right? And so there's going to be a lot of flexibility. Flexibility is going to be the word, right? Is that we may need to rethink how we've done things in the past. I think academic advising is one of those things. We talk about students feeling safe. I think something that can be really intimidating for any student is to, go try to have a one-on-one conversation with a faculty member in their office, right? And so I think that the remote environment provides that level, a new level of safety for them to have these conversations and do it comfortably remotely, and we'll probably continue to do that. I do hope for our non-traditional students that we also continue to offer some flexibility. I think that the desire, on the part of the overall university, is that we move back to an engaged in-person experience as much as possible. In the midst of that, I hope we don't miss out on students that would benefit from something that looks more hybrid. particularly as we have, so many faculty and programs across so many campuses. I hope we continue the ability that, a student at Abington can take a class at Altoona. I think that's one of the things that's going to be exciting about the future. We did some of that before, right? We had some things in place pre-pandemic to do that, but I hope we populate it even more moving forward. Because I think that's the other thing we have, across our Commonwealth, we have such a breadth of expertise that, I want our students and frankly, our faculty as well to take advantage of that. I think that, there have been conversations in the past, particularly, I think we've spoken a lot about undergraduate education, but graduate education, is similar to that of the arts. It's a real mentoring experience, right? That you have an advisor, you have a committee, that those people are there to mentor you in your research and scholarship and practice. But that I think in the past, it's been really the attitude that that's a residential thing, right? That your advisor needs to be physically present in order to advise you. And I hope that that goes away because I think we've proven that we can advise students and do it well remotely. And so that I'm really hopeful that we see, particularly in graduate education, graduate students committees being advised by, our full faculty that we have access to. I think that will present some other challenges administratively that that folks like us will get through. But I do think that the students will benefit a lot from these the ability to stay hybrid in the future. We've shown it can work. I think that's what the folks who were naysayers previously can't say anymore. Like, we did it. We've done it for a year. It's not perfect, but it works. And so we should take the good parts of it and keep doing them. We shouldn't, I hope it is not just an automatic, like, we need to be back to the way everything, as much as everything was before. But that we can, I think we've all discussed that we can keep the kind of good discoveries that we've made that continue to, provide access in the broader sense, right? Not just education, but to the full resources of our university.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Corey, and I appreciate the discussion about non-traditional students. I think when we think of the traditional student, the definition, right, is 18 to 24, receives most of their support from parents or caregivers, and is a full-time college student with few other outside obligations. And I think recent research tells us that almost 75% of students in post-secondary ed do not fit that category. So, and as a non-traditional student myself, the office hours that we have, as you spoke to advising, but also our bursar, our registrar, our functions on campus, I couldn't get there between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. sometimes, but I could get there at 6:30 when somebody else was home able to take care of my 3 children, and I could run up. So I think I really am committed to maintaining that access and really thinking about our non-traditional student populations. There was an article several months ago in Inside Higher Ed by Stephen Mintz, and he talked about principles. I think he talked about 7 principles that should underlie post-coronavirus decision-making in higher ed. And he really hit the nail on the head with these. He talked about equity, accessibility, affordability, a real focus on learning and learning outcomes, flexibility, resilience, and then of course, sustainability, which is what we're talking about here today. And I, from my standpoint and looking, on our beautiful Abington campus, we are bound in terms of space. So we only have so much space. It's a precious resource and commodity for us. So I hope that I'm able to really be creative about thinking about flexibility in our use of space and how we allocate to free up more space for what our core mission is, which is the academic mission. So I think as we think about moving forward, being creative, challenging the ways that we've done things in the past, because we've seen that they can be challenged and we can come out better and stronger. And we are, I've seen just in the last, just over the last year, I think we've progressed 5 years in terms of, what would have taken us 5 years time to get to in this past year. So I think the collective power, Vagner, as you spoke about earlier, our collective power to really, to have a large amount of agency in our collective action and moving our approach to higher education, our approach to access, our approach to really how we're doing business is of the highest impact right now. And I want to kind of just loop back a little bit earlier, as you know, as we were finishing up our last topic. And I think this is something also that has to carry us forward. Our faculty, who have also, in addition to our students who have sheltered in place, who have taken on multiple extra roles and have to wear multiple extra hats. And I know myself, my desk has been my kitchen table for the better part of a year. So how do we separate, how do we maintain from a well-being standpoint, the space of workspace versus private and home space? And those have really bled into each other this past year. But I think being very intentional about supporting all of our communities in helping create those boundaries, and then being very, very intentional as we continue to move forward in the post-COVID world, being intentional about relationship building and community building.
Yes, I think when COVID started, a lot of us, or some of us, enjoy the notion of working from home. But for me, soon after it became living at work. That's how I felt, that I was actually living at work all the time. To the point where now I go to campus as often as I can, and I'm the only person there. It's just so I can be removed in geography. But I've been thinking a lot about space. I think space and privilege is going to continue to be highlighted. For example, do people have a proper space to work from home, whether they're students, staff, or faculty? I'm thinking about space and technology. Are we gonna have more boundaries or less boundaries? Going with what you're saying, Corey, are we gonna have like video devices in our cars and in our offices? Are we gonna have more screens so that we can have this sort of more seamless transition between actual and virtual space at any given place? I think that could be fascinating, actually. But again, it could bring up some notions of privilege as well. And then I was also thinking in terms of space and geography. What does it mean to be in one place in the future? We have in universities, right? Whether you're in resident or not, or non-resident student, right? That actually affects your economy, right? What happens with international students? So the utopic side of me thinks, oh, this is the end of countries, right? All boundaries are gone, right? We are all one big world, right? Because that would make most sense, right? To have this sort of flexibility or fluidity of space. But again, this also still speaks of privilege, right? So it's really complicated. So I think the future can be super exciting, but again, it could also bring forth some of the problems we have now. And I suspect that we will have some sort of like post-pandemic mourning, right? Because there have been some real positive experiences. My family lives really far away in different countries, right? But we have become much closer, even in mediated ways, right? For staff, a lot of times working from home is a real benefit for them, and for people that commute in general, right? Not having the commute as part of their daily lives, that has been an improvement in the quality of life, right? And just the thought of getting in a car and driving for 45 minutes, parking in a garage, working for 8 hours and driving back home, that's pretty complicated, right? I mean, and so I hope that we're able to sustain what is advantageous to our humanity and reimagine a new future. One thing that is really difficult for the arts, and maybe in every other discipline, is that we haven't really changed what we do, right? We're still pretty much have education that is very similar to the 1960s and 70s. Even courses are still the same titles, right? This notion of beginning, intermediate, and advanced, for example, right? And a lot of visual arts education is also, it's similar to sort of the conservatory in music, right? But for us, it's more like the lyceum, right? It's sort of like teacher as mentor and the apprentice model, right? So if we can't escape from the history of our pedagogy and focus in the practice of learning outcomes, I think the gap could widen even more in the future. Because it will take a lot of us many years to economically recover from this one way or another. And even as an institution, right? They were talking about in a recent meeting that the COVID pandemic will have at least 5 years impact at Penn State, financially speaking. So it'll be interesting to see what rises and what remains in the future. But Simone, I think you wanted to ask a question. So we're like at the 45-minute time. You're muted.
Okay, I said I didn't want to interrupt, already have, right? Well, thank you for all these comments. They've been really wonderful. And I was going to ask, how was the applying for a job, going through an interview, starting the new job through COVID? And I can tell right now that it's been a really interesting, positive, flexible experience, and that you guys are going to really help us figure this out. This is amazing. Thank you. I was going to give S3A as an example. I've been at Penn State for 20 years, and I had never worked with the other campuses. And all of a sudden, because of family health issues, I had to move to Seattle, and I could be in the same room with Rebecca and Yvonne and everybody else. So we have people all over the US working in this symposium, in this project, in other projects. So I'll ask one question that I was thinking, and maybe deviate a little bit. And I think Rebecca also has a question for us. Okay, so let me do mine first. I was thinking, how does an institution welcome outreach and public engagement? I was thinking of what Margo said about space, and how do we continue to collaborate? Like when we are back into the physical space, can we open new venues? I imagine we're going to reinvent, how higher education is going to operate. And I would say from everything you said, Margo, it really resonated with me, teaching students on cell phones and students who are very, they don't want you to know their situation sometimes, and you're having a student falling off the charts there, and you have to discover and go give attention and understand what's going on. Somebody's driving an Uber, delivering pizza, and being in my class at the same time. So all these situations are new for me, and I have to now I don't think they're going to be new anymore. Like we are understanding how unequal the question of access is, and we have to address it. So yeah, so thank you for that. So I was the question, if you wanted to go back, I think you remember, right, about outreach, and what was it? It was institution. How does an institution welcome outreach and public engagement?
I think for us, it really comes down to intentionality and to listening to what our community's needs are. And I always use the not so tongue-in-cheek example of, knock, knock, we're the university and we're here to help you. That's not the way that we should engage as universities and campuses, but really, and as Corey said, if you look across the Commonwealth at all of the Penn State locations, Abington is different from Brandywine, which is different from Altoona, which is different from Du Bois, which is different from University Park. So we have got this amazing range across the Commonwealth. And so thinking that we have the answer is not the right approach, but really working with our communities to understand what the true needs are. I think that's when outreach works best, when we're collaboratively solving problems that have been identified by the people who are experiencing those challenges, rather than me deciding what those challenges are and how to solve them. It really, I think it goes back to kind of like feminist standpoint theory, where it really is the experience of the individual that creates the knowledge and co-constructs. So very constructivist and very, very situational. I think that's the best outreach, when we can listen and we can understand and we can collaboratively respond, rather than that top-down approach that, here's what we need to do and let's do it. It has to be co-constructed.
Wonderful.
I think I think very similarly, when I am particularly teaching beginning design students in the field of architecture, they want people to experience certain things, right? And so they think of, how can I build an architecture that, they don't use the word force, but essentially is like, will force people to experience certain things. And so I spend a lot of time with them talking about an architecture of opportunity, an architecture that is generous, an architecture that allows for exploration. And I think the same thing is true of the university, right? That if we go out and say, you know, this is what we're going to do, as Margo says, that doesn't work, right? And it also, I found it doesn't work for me in my role now as an administrator to say, this is what we're going to be doing. You know, that you know, we need faculty and staff in particular who are passionate about this engagement with the community, and that because they're the ones who build the relationships, they're the ones who then we can provide the resources that we have to go out and do excellent work. But it is for me, it's really about, you know, how can we provide opportunity. Not just for our students, of course, we think about that a lot, but I also think about how can we provide opportunity, you know, for the community to engage us. And in a Commonwealth campus, that happens regularly through multiple, you know, we have multiple sort of outreach arms in ways that we can engage and as Margo is saying, listen. Really listen to our communities and their needs, and it turns into very unique things. Penn State Altoona has the only accredited undergraduate degree in rail transportation engineering. That has to do with Altoona's history. You know, Altoona did not exist until they tried to build a rail line from here to Pittsburgh, and they built a town in order to support the difficult work of getting over the next set of mountains. And so this whole town, it literally is built around the railroad industry, both physically and and historically in terms of its economy. And so, you know, that's ingrained as part of us, because that's, you know, that's how our campus, one way in which our campus reflects our community.
Similarly, well, again, you know, we talked earlier about like lifting the veil, and I think I personally have come to a lot of awareness in this period. I see a parallel between my art practice and my teaching practice, which I had never seen before, which has always been about looking at the center and decentering things. So even in the classroom, you know, I've always had environments where people looked in the center. When I do installation art, it's always a space for people to walk into. And I think as a leader, it's the same thing, right? So the idea of making space and creating opportunities, I think it's something that I'm thinking about. So in terms of creating opportunities, I actually think of the centering and decentering of Penn State University as a huge wealth, right? Can we create and then, you know, I have a purview of a small slice of this greater institution, which is in the visual arts, right? And of course, I'm not alone doing this. There are a lot of people involved. But, you know, are there ways in which we can come together, all the different practitioners of the arts at Penn State, and whether it's physically or virtually, and can we break some boundaries and make some ties that it can be something way more interesting than what it is right now. And I think if we can figure out ways, or at least to have these conversations, I think our students will benefit as well, in addition to our communities, right? I mean, State College might be similar to Altoona that way, right? I mean, this town is here because of the university, right? And the economies of these small towns have been greatly affected by the pandemic, right? And so how do we incorporate this into this conversation? I don't know, but I think we have the right sentiment and thinking that at least the three of us can probably work on something in the future, right? But many more. But there's one more question from Rebecca, so I'll finish now.
Oh, thank you all. And thank you all for your time today on this Saturday. The conversation's been really engaging. I'm glad it's being recorded because I think it should be shared. I think it's coming at the pandemic challenges with a unique lens, one with design and art and architecture in mind. And I think that's really important. I'm not sure if we have time to answer my question, but I think, you know, Corey said there's no silver linings, and I agree with him. But with that being said, I kind of think of the pandemic as a design problem, and we have this new set of constraints. And when you have those, you also can start to identify your opportunities. And one of the things we're doing at Altoona in Visual Art Studies is we're looking very hard at our spaces that have been mostly empty, and really trying to disconnect the people from the spaces they work in, because it's so hard. Like faculty who've been around for a very long time are, that's my space and those are my tools. And I built this thing from nothing. And it's very difficult to separate that and not hurt feelings and crunch egos. And but I think because of the time and space provided by the pandemic, we've been able to do that, at least just in our modest art area. And we're letting go of some things. We're shedding some things that are not needed and rebuilding in really interesting and kind of inventive ways, I think. But I wonder if that's something that you think about as administrators. Like, I know you, like Corey said, you can't tell faculty what to do. That never works. But if presented in the right way as a design problem and given the right set of opportunities, like, isn't this now the time to get rid of the things that we've been doing since the 60s, like that our students just don't care about anymore?
Yeah, Rebecca, that's something that I think about constantly as a leader and administrator in higher ed, and doing it in a way that centers the individual, because what you said, people are protective of space, and space is identity in a lot of ways as well. Their identity is tied up in that. But I think approaching it, as you said, a design problem, at Penn State Abington, we have real constraints on our space and its use, and really thinking about strategically using that. And I think the way that the conversation moves forward productively is by, first of all, being respectful of those histories, but, and then also providing viable alternatives for people where they don't feel displaced, but having them be the problem solvers and centering the question, how are our decisions putting the best interest of our students at the center? So I think if we center our students and their experience at all of these conversations, I think it becomes a different conversation, and not one of subtraction, but addition. We're adding capacity, we're building capacity. And, thinking, borrowing from the sciences, I'm really looking at, as Abington progresses, on, an open lab concept, but then also an open studio concept. So how are we creating flexible space that accommodates the most number of people, that provides for the best student experience, and does so in a way that's within our limits, but really expands our capacity?
Excellent. Thank you, Margo.
Yeah, it comes at an interesting time. As Rebecca knows, on our campus, is that we're in the midst of looking at redesigning our student services hub, a building from the 1950s that is not very it's accessible in the ADA sense of accessible, but it's very hard to find student services in. It's very maze-like. It's a very unusual building. And so, we already had it, even before the pandemic started, we were working on this project, but the pandemic has very much changed our thoughts about, what's going to happen inside that building, and what is really needed, and how can we provide more supportive student services in this new time, and what is that going to look like? It's been good conversations. I don't know that we've come to any conclusions. But they're very much, what Margo just said is that not just faculty, even staff have identity with space, right? And so it's been very hard. There've been some difficult conversations that say, like, I think we can provide a better student experience, but in order for us to do that, we have to change the way the space looks. We can't just replicate what was there before. Like, in order for the students to have a better experience, at least in our case, every one of our student services has its own little office suite behind a closed door down a very long, somewhere in the building through a series of hallways. And that, I don't think that's the best way to present student services. So I think everybody agrees that it's not, but then, I think that, again, a lot of listening and dialogue is necessary to see, to get to the point where we can have a shared vision for the future, right? I think that's the important thing, is making sure that we have the space for that. So,
thank you, Corey.
I'll be really brief because we're running out of time, but I would say, adding to the identity of space, there's also this collection of identities also forms the culture, right? And ultimately, we're talking about changing culture, and those things are really, really difficult. So in my particular case, I still need to learn the culture here, But I think I need to have some conversations with you, Rebecca, and maybe we need to collaborate on some strategies. And because I think it's really important to think of this not as an ego-driven, but a need-driven, and perhaps design it's something more objective that I think would be really, really important. But we'll see. It'll be a process one way or another.
I would love that anytime.
Great. I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Simone, for giving us the opportunity. Thank you, Margo and Corey, for sharing your stories and experiences with us. And thank you, Rebecca, and everybody who has watched or joined us.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you also. Everything you said make me so hopeful, you know, it does. And it seems like we're going to turn our corners very fast and very soon. And it's great to have you guys helping in this direction. It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing all your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Take care. Turning this off.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.